did a great job the first time. I don't think you should expect any less today. We're going to get all the details that we didn't have time for last time. So what I'd like to do is just tell everybody a little bit about our vendors on the website. Are we putting everybody up there? Great, Jeff. These are the companies that work with us online on the website. Will is one of them. And anything you want to know about association reserves, you can find up on the website, as well as we record these programs that Will does. So you can always go back for reference if you need him. And there are RFPs up there and anything else you need to get in touch with Will. The other thing is tomorrow we're going to have our live event at the Airport Hilton. And we have a whole bunch of service providers up there that like to do business with you. So if you have a chance, come on up tomorrow. You get a nice free hot breakfast. And you're going to get to hear the paving lady. Morrow is their speaker. And he does a great job letting you know everything you need to know about asphalt. So without taking up any more time, we're going to get Will started so we have enough time for question and answers. And whatever else it is that you need to get from Will this morning. So with that, Will, take it away.
Take it away. All right. Good morning, everybody. Thank you. Thank you. I'll say hello and good morning to everybody here on camera just for a moment. If you've been with this class before, you'll kind of feel like some of this stuff might be familiar. Thanks as always to Terry and Jeff from TSK for putting this on. You guys always do a great job, and I really appreciate the opportunity to be with you, to work with you guys, and hopefully, although I can't see you, I'm sure there's some familiar faces out there. Hopefully a lot of you attended the course that we put on back on July 16th. That was called Fundamentals of Reserves. In the event that you missed it, that's okay. As Jeff said, we do have a recording of that class, so feel free to go back and watch that one. If you did miss it, that might be a good idea because some of the concepts, some of the definitions, the terminologies that we introduced last time are going to play a big role in today's material. So feel free to go back and watch that. Today's class is called Reserve Funding Methodologies. It's going to go for about an hour. We will have that time for Q&A. So last time and the last few times that I've taught this course, there tends to be a lot of questions that come in. So just so you know, feel free to ask the question anytime, use that Q&A button on the Zoom taskbar, but I will get through all those at the end. So, I'm going to do my best to stay on as long as I can and answer as many questions as possible. Don't worry about asking about copies of the slides or copies of the recording. That's going to go out to everybody. For all the CAMs in the audience, we will be reporting your course credits to the DBPR probably within the next, I would say hopefully by the end of this week, but certainly within the next week. So again, one more quick reminder. This happened to me one time this year, and I'm going to hope it doesn't happen again today, but just in the case that we have any technical difficulties, okay? If I happen to lose power or lose the internet in my building, stay with us, stay tuned. I will do my best to reconnect and join as quick as possible. Jeff has a bunch of stand-up jokes he's going to tell in that event, so we'll do our best. But
you'll be stuck with Terry and I doing some karaoke.
Yeah,
and
there you go.
Just one quick thing. I see somebody put his CAM number in the Q&A. You don't need to do that. As the webinar comes to an end, towards the end of it, when we get to the Q&A, we'll place in the chat the link for the evaluation. You fill that out. That's what we use to get the information we need to upload the credits. It'll also appear in a post-webinar window that'll pop up. You click on the link, you'll get the survey that way. And then a third method will be in tomorrow's follow-up email thanking you all for being here. That email will also contain the webinar, the evaluation link. And also on that same evaluation page, there is a button. You press that button, you'll be able to get the slides that you're going to see in just a short bit.
Perfect. Yeah. Jeff, I need one more thing from you. I just tried to share my screen and it said I was unable to do so. So if you can allow, there we go. Should be good now. Okay. Can I get a confirmation you can see reserve funding methodologies?
We see it.
Awesome. Okay. I'm going to turn off my video. We'll get going here in just a second. Thank you. Okay, here we go. Again, thanks so much for joining us today, everybody. My name is Will Simons. I'll be teaching the course. Before I do that, just to get you a little bit of background, this course is called Reserve Funding Methodologies. It is approved for 1 hour of continuing education credit in either the insurance and financial management section or as an elective. As Jeff said, you'll already be getting all the credit for today's course, so no need to email us. We should have all that information already on file. I don't want to give the impression that the course is only for managers. If there's any board members, committee members, volunteers, people from other industries that that have tuned in today, you're going to learn a lot. Everybody's going to come away better prepared to lead and serve the communities that we all work with. So without further ado, let me give a little bit more introduction to myself and our company. I'm the president of the Florida office for Association Reserves, been with the company now since 2008. The RS letter after my name stands for Reserve Specialist. That's an industry specific credential that is only awarded to people that have demonstrated their experience and expertise in preparing reserve studies. It comes from CAI, the Community Associations Institute. As of right now, we have 5 reserve specialists on our Florida staff, and I think it's actually now close to 30 amongst all of our offices around the country. I've lived in both condos and HOAs. I spent about 6 years serving as the treasurer of my own community here in South Florida. We oversaw a budget there of over $1 million. We had a 635 home HOA. The reason I point that out is because I do know what it's like to be on the other side of the table, working with the volunteers, with the boards, the committees, all the great people out there who are donating their time and taking on the responsibility of managing their associations, which, as we all know, can represent hundreds of people and many, many millions of dollars worth of property value. Okay, so who's our company? Well, our company is the oldest and largest reserve study provider in the United States. We've been in this business now since 1986, and we've completed tens of thousands of reserve studies for all different types of properties all around the world. As I mentioned, we've got offices from coast to coast, and as far as I can tell, I believe we have more credentialed reserve specialists on staff than any other company. The majority of the work that we do is for community associations, which of course includes all types of condos, HOAs, timeshares, and other residential communities. But we do have a great deal of experience with other property types. So if you represent office buildings, hotels, resort properties, worship facilities, and others, we can absolutely help you with a reserve study as well. One thing I always do like to point out is that it is our only job as a company to prepare reserve studies. We are not an engineering firm, we're not an accounting firm, but rather we're a very specialized consulting firm, which is focused on doing this one thing really well, which is to guide our clients towards a successful financial future. The way that we do that is by preparing these accurate and reliable reserve studies, which help our clients to forecast and budget for major projects. We always think that if we do our job well and that our clients follow those plans that we help them to design, hopefully they're able to reduce the risk of special assessments and bank loans and other forms of financial distress. So if you'd like any additional information, please visit our website. You're going to see it down in the bottom right corner of your screen, reservestudy.com. Also, you can feel free to shoot me an email if there's something that we don't get to today, or if your question doesn't get answered during the Q&A. I'll have my email address up on screen later, but that is wsimons@reservestudy.com, WSIMONS@reservestudy.com. Okay, all right, so quick outline just to show you what we're going to talk about today. Really just 2 main sections. The first section here is going to focus on the philosophy, okay, the reasoning behind why it's important to have reserves at all. Put it another way, why is it not okay for an association to just pass a special assessment or go out and get a loan every time it needs to take on a big project? In that last class that I mentioned, the one last month, we spent a lot of time going over the concept of percent funded. It's going to be very important for us to understand that now. So if you did miss that, feel free to go back and kind of get familiar with that. Take 15, 20 minutes, and that concept will really be much more easy to understand if you do so. Once we do understand percent funded, then we'll move into the heart of the course today, which is a very detailed overview of the 2 different reserve funding methodologies. There's the title of the class for you. Those are known as the pooled method and the straight line method. So if you have any questions about those two different methods, hopefully we'll be able to help clear that up for you today. So again, let's start with the basics. Why have reserves at all? And to put this in perspective, I like to pose a kind of a hypothetical question, and that is, what are reserves for? Okay, why do associations collect reserves? And to be more specific, is it for the here and now, or is it for the future? Right. So take a moment, cue the Jeopardy music in your mind for a second. Okay, settle on your answer, and then let's talk about this. So back in the pre-COVID days when we used to do everything live, and I would ask this in a live setting, I would ask everybody to put their hands up, you know, is it for the here and now or for the future? And most of the time, the majority of the room would say, well, reserves are for the future. Well, I'm going to start off right off the bat here, making this, I think, very critical point, which is that reserve funding should be thought of as for the here and now. Let me explain what I mean by that. We think it's a misunderstanding to think of reserve funding as saving up for a future project, okay? Now, the reason why that's not a great approach is because there's oftentimes a very good chance that the current owners that live in a property won't be there by the time that future project takes place. So it might seem to make sense to them that they shouldn't be funding reserves towards a project that they won't get the benefit from. But I would encourage you all to think of this in a different way, okay? Instead, if you think of reserve funding as paying the current bill of deterioration that is occurring in the present day, that's a more appropriate way to think of it. Think of it like a pay-as-you-go model. And I'll give you a quick example to kind of illustrate this. Let's say that I were to buy a unit in a brand new condo building. And let's assume that the roof on that building has a 20-year lifespan. Now, if I live there for the first 15 years of that building's existence, I'm going to enjoy 15 years of use and value out of the roof on that building, not to mention all of the other building components, the mechanical systems, the amenities, and so forth. Now, let's say I want to sell my unit after those first 15 years, and I've got an incoming buyer who's going to buy it from me, and they'll live there for the next 15 years, okay? But remember the math, only 5 years after they buy my unit, the building's going to be 20 years old and that roof is likely to need to be replaced. Now, this is where it gets a little tricky. If I had not been charged accordingly during the time that I lived there, meaning I was not contributing towards the cost of that roof replacement through reserve funding, then the new buyer is essentially going to get stuck with the full cost of the replacement project. At that point, they will have only lived there for 5 years or the last 25% of the roof's lifespan, but they'll essentially have to pay for the full 20 years worth of cost. Okay, they're paying their share of the life of the roof, but also my share, even though I've moved away, I'm long gone. Now, you may be wondering, well, so what? Well, if you're the second buyer and you're deciding between a couple of buildings to buy into, the fact that my association doesn't have a healthy reserve fund means that you, as the new buyer, are going to be more exposed to higher cost and a higher chance of a special assessment to make up for the years during which I was not being charged for my share of that cost. Okay. All right. So in our business, we talk about these 4 reserve rules. First of all, the expenses are inevitable. Okay, there's no getting around the fact that air conditioning systems need to be replaced, elevators need to be modernized, roads need to be repaved. Okay. Number 2, the board is always responsible. They are the ones entrusted with managing the community association on behalf of all their fellow owners. Next up, when projects get delayed, they tend to become more expensive. We see this all the time, especially in the case of roofs and concrete restoration and other building exterior components, right? Now, most importantly, homeowners will always get stuck paying the bill, right? There's no Uncle Sam, there's no government bailout that's going to come for community associations that do not have adequate reserve funding. All right. Just as there are 4 rules for reserve planning, there are only 4 options for how to eventually pay those bills. Now, the first and best option, of course, is to have that healthy reserve fund. No question about that. The second best option is to pass a special assessment when those projects come along. Now, I always kind of joke here, it should be obvious that it's a bad situation when the second best option on the table has this skull and crossbones warning on it. And if you've ever managed or lived in a community that has recurring special assessments, hopefully you know what I mean by that. That's a toxic thing for a community to go through. The next best option would be to take out a loan or a line of credit to pay for a project. But the reason I have that ranked after a special assessment is because, of course, the cost of the project will be greater due to the cost of the financing involved, okay? And what happens if you don't do any of those three? Well, then the only choice is you basically allow the property to fall into disrepair, right? If you're not paying any money out of pocket up front to take care of it, then you will eventually feel that pain when it comes to a decline in property value. One more point to make on that third option there, the loan line of credit. And this is something that I've been working into this presentation just in the last 2 months. Obviously in light of the Champlain Towers South collapse, this is just a horrific tragedy. And I would hate for this to be lost as an opportunity to learn some lessons, right? So some of you may have seen in the news that that building was in pretty dire straits financially, and it came to light that they had actually gone out to try to get loans for some of the projects that had to be done, but they were turned down. Okay, it is I think it was 2 different banks had said no. Eventually, they found one that was going to be able to lend them some money for all the exterior repairs they had to do. That was this spring, and unfortunately, they ran out of time before anything could be done there. But the reason I point that out is because, over the years, we've had lots and lots of clients that have always just felt like they had that kind of emergency option in their back pocket. Well, we'll just go out and borrow some money. That is not an automatic option anymore. I'm not saying it's extremely difficult, but the game has changed a little bit, and you can be absolutely sure that lenders will be taking a very different approach to association lending in light of what's happened here this summer. So not to belabor that point, but I do think that's relevant to point out these days. Okay, so these are some of the specific benefits if you're going with that option A of having a healthy reserve fund. Starting at the top, you shouldn't have any surprises, or at least a much lower chance of getting caught by surprise. All right, if you're funding your reserves, if you're paying attention, that means that you're going to be tracking the remaining useful life expectancies of all your components. That gives you the option to plan ahead, to prepare for when they need to be replaced, rather than reacting and getting caught by surprise when something fails, okay? When you're planning ahead, that also gives you the chance to shop around, okay, to select from different providers. Having more time on your side gives you the ability to seek out more bids, maybe to hire a project manager to work on your behalf. You can hopefully minimize cost by working with some of those contractors. As a quick example, you might talk to your painting company and ask them, hey, is there a more advantageous time of year? Do you guys have a slow season where we might be able to work with you and get a little bit of a break? On the flip side, if you're calling out to your contractors on an emergency basis because, let's say it's the 4th of July and your cooling tower just failed, you have no air conditioning in the building, well, then you're always going to get stuck paying a higher cost because that's a rush nature. That's an emergency, okay? The point here that I have about minimizing exposure, this is relevant to the board members out there. And what I mean by that is that if you're proactively taking care of your property, you're doing a better job of upholding your fiduciary duty, which gives you better protection against any potential complaints, potential lawsuits that may come from the ownership. Now, the last thing to point out here is that if you're doing all of these things, that should naturally lead to increasing property values, okay? In our experience, communities that are doing a good job of reserve funding tend to have better curb appeal, okay? They're more up to date with respect to technology. They have more modern amenities than those that don't. All of that contributes to a better ownership experience for the people who live there, which in turn makes them more attractive to potential buyers. Of course, we could argue that all the opposites are true if you don't have a healthy reserve fund. That means you are more exposed to surprises. Those can lead to higher expenses, more liability exposure, and, worst comes to worst, declining property value. And one of the real problems that we run into is that when communities get into this sort of vicious cycle, it becomes more and more difficult to break out of it as the years go on. So, especially if you're in a newer building, if you've just come off a bunch of big projects where you've kind of restored your building to good condition, don't allow yourselves to slip back into that hole, right? Stay out in front of these things. It'll be a lot easier for you in your ownership. Okay, going to go real briefly here through this percent funded topic. As I mentioned, this is something that we talk about in the last class. But for anybody who didn't make it through here, I'm gonna go through this real briefly. This gives us a very reliable, very consistent way to measure the strength of an association's reserve account at any point in time. Okay, percent funded is basically a snapshot in time of financial strength. It helps us to evaluate how well an association is doing with respect to reserve funding in the present day, even though many of its projects may not be coming due for many years. Okay, fundamentally, this is a way to measure risk. Specifically, what we mean there is the risk of financial problems such as special assessments and bank loans. Okay, percent funded is not fixed. It will fluctuate in time based on cash flow. So if you're contributing to your reserves in a healthy way, hopefully you'll actually see that percent funded will increase over time. That means that your association will become better prepared for its major projects, okay? All right, so I'm going to talk through the kind of the concept of percent funded. There is a section in the last class where we actually go through the specific calculations, kind of the process of doing it. But for right now, we're just going to go through the concept, okay? So to an outside party like a bank or a credit score, like a bank or a credit card company, your credit score is an indicator of what kind of risk you are. So I've always felt that this is a good analogy to use to explain percent funded. If you think of the reserve study itself like a credit report and you have to distill it down to one key result, that would be percent funded, okay? We measure it on a 0 to 100% scale, and we consider anything between 0 and 30% funded to be a weak position. So in that range, associations will have a much higher likelihood of special assessments, of cash flow problems. Once you get above 30% funded, you're into this kind of fair position where there's still a risk, but it's more moderate, okay? Where you really want to be, though, is above 70% funded, where we've seen there's a very low risk of those types of problems occurring. Okay, so as I said, you may have the slides here, but I'm going to go ahead and skip through this kind of process of how to calculate percent funded, only in the interest of time, but we can go back to this in the Q&A if anybody is particularly interested, okay? Bear with me for just a moment. Okay, I do want to linger here for just a second here. This is a chart here where we show some of the financial conclusions you can draw about associations based on their level of percent funded. So what you're looking at on the chart here is the result of a very large internal analysis that our company did a number of years ago. What we did was we looked at a data set of thousands of associations we had worked with, and we measured for two different variables. First, what was their percent funded level? And second, did we, yes or no, include a special assessment recommendation as part of their funding plan in their reserve study? Now, the results here were pretty obvious, okay? They're consistent with what we expected, but bottom line is the closer an association is to 0% funded, meaning the less money they have in the bank, the higher the chances they would need immediate special assessments as part of their funding plan going forward. But the good news is what we saw was that even once you're just out of the weak range, okay, getting here to even 40% funded, that risk decreased dramatically. Okay, it was only about 10% of the time that we recommended an immediate special assessment when you were in even a low fair position. Even better though, once you get above 70%, that risk drops to about 1 in 100. So very clear takeaway, very easy to understand that the higher your percent funded, the better off your building will be. It's like having a high credit score. Okay, all right, so a few years later, we did another internal study. This time we were wanting to see, is there a correlation between percent funded and actual property value in the homes within a given community? So the way we did this one was to look at a large data set from a big metropolitan area, basically greater Los Angeles, California. And what we did here was to select a group of properties that were all as similar as they could be in terms of size and age and amenities and so forth, okay? We then measured the appraised market value of the homes in those communities to see what difference it made when the associations themselves were in better financial position. So to be specific, what we wanted to know was what type of increase would we see if an association is in a better financial position as measured by percent funded. So the first thing we did was we set a baseline. Okay, we said, let's look at some communities that are in that weak position, 0 to 30% funded. And we want to find out what gain will we determine when they move into a fair or a strong position. Okay, so again, just to make this very clear, all of these properties were as equal as they could be, right? Similar demographics, similar location, similar number of units, similar amenities, similar age, and so forth. But the ones that had a higher percent funded, the ones that were in a fair position were about 8% more valuable, measured in dollars per square foot property value than the ones that were in the baseline group, the control group, the weaker associations. Now, even more interesting, the ones that were in the strong position, okay, above 70% funded, they had an almost 13% gain in property value compared to the control group. So again, you can kind of see how that would be. Made the point earlier, but the associations that have money in the bank, again, tend to have better curb appeal, better physical condition. You might even argue better morale. They're not firing their management company every 18 months. Okay, the residents are happy. There's maybe fewer investor owners. There's people that are invested and want to stay in the community. All of that hopefully contributes to them being more attractive to the potential buyers out there. So going back to that first question, why have reserves at all? Well, you can argue that one answer is that hopefully will come back to you in the form of higher property value. All right, so that was kind of the first half of the class. Looks like we're doing well on time. This last portion here, I think, is maybe the most important part, especially right now as we're getting into budget season. So we're going to talk about the two ways that associations calculate reserve funding. First up, I'm going to go through this method here called the straight line method. And the other term for this, for this method is called the component method. The reason for that is that all the components here are treated separately from a funding standpoint. Personally, I've always thought of this kind of the old-fashioned way. More and more communities are switching to the pooled method. Part of the reason why it's the old-fashioned way is that because prior to 2002, at least in the state of Florida, it was the only option, right? The way that I characterize this one is that it's more simple in theory, but it becomes more troublesome when you try to actually apply it and put it into practice. All right, so if you want to understand how this works, I think it's helpful if you think of each category of reserve components as being handled in separate buckets. Okay, so for now, let's assume we're talking about these 5 buckets: the roof, elevator, painting, mechanical, and pavement. Okay. In this method, each year, you're going to determine the amount of reserve funding going into each category, into each bucket, using a very simple calculation. Basically, you're going to take the cost of the component, subtract out any existing funds that are already saved, and you divide the remaining difference by the remaining useful life of that component. Okay, and the result of that calculation will then tell you the amount required to fully fund the component in that following year's budget. Okay, we'll use the roof reserve or the roof bucket as our first example here. If you understand that the total volume of the bucket, right, the total capacity here represents the total cost to replace that roof, and if you look at your existing roof reserves as being the contents of that bucket, the difference right here, the empty portion, that's what we might consider the unfunded balance. It's basically just, again, the difference between the total cost to replace it less the existing money you've already saved up. Now, if we put some actual numbers to this, we can say that, let's say the cost of replacing our roof is $200,000. If we've already got $140 in existing cash in our roof reserve, then your unfunded balance, of course, is $60,000. So in order for me to determine how much I need to be funding that roof reserve going forward, I'm going to take my $200,000 cost, subtract out my $140 in existing reserves, and I'm going to divide the difference by the remaining useful life of that roof. Okay, so let's say that we've determined the remaining life is 3 years. So what I'm going to do now is take my 200,000, subtract 140, which gives us the 60,000. I'm going to then divide that by 3 years, which means I need to put $20,000 a year into my roof reserve for the next 3 years in order to fully fund my roof. Okay. Now, in order to complete the budget, I'm just going to do that same process for all my remaining buckets. Okay. Now, as you play this out over time, you can see how you might end up with a variety of different funding positions. Okay. Depending on how accurate your assumptions were for life expectancies and costs, some of those accounts may be very well funded, while others are not in a good shape at all. So in our view, the term I always use here is that this makes for an inefficient distribution of all of the association's actual total reserve cash, right? Money can be locked up in one place, and when it would be very advantageous to move it over to something else, which may be a higher priority, that starts to make things get very complicated. All right, some of the more, I guess some of the more, behind the scenes problems you might deal with when using this method. First of all, it's very often the case that there's been no prior reserve fund established for something important, something like concrete restoration. Another issue is that the funds may be too broadly defined, right? For example, we might see that there's one large combined account, which is just labeled as mechanical, right? And in theory, that's supposed to capture everything from security cameras to fire alarms to cooling towers. Now, we should all know those have very different life expectancies, very different replacement costs. If they're all combined into this one broad category, you're going to have to start doing some really complicated math to figure out how to determine the amount of money that's going into the account in total. For you managers out there, I'm sure you can understand the component method can be a lot more of a headache. All right, why is that? Well, under this method, the statutes require that the owners have to vote to approve the moving of funds from one place to another. So from elevator reserves to parking lot reserves, for example. Now, I think you guys all know out there that getting a quorum, passing a vote for anything in an association is a very difficult task, but I would argue that that's especially true when it comes to moving money around. Okay, residents are often very skeptical of their boards. They're hesitant to give that approval unless they fully understand the situation. Now, that often means the board, the manager have to call a special meeting, send a bunch of emails, maybe even get the attorney involved. It's just a management, an administrative headache at that point. Now, lastly, and I think the most serious problem with this method is that because it is more conservative, associations are not making the most efficient use of the sum total of all of their available reserve money. That ends up costing the owners in the association more money out of pocket each year to fund the reserves using this method, okay? Now, I'll just tell you from personal experience, at the end of each year, as a company, we look back at all the studies we've produced that year. And we look at the funding recommendations for our clients that are using the straight line method. Right now, the last couple of years have been about 1/3 of the properties we work with are still using straight line. When we do their studies, though, we're still going to provide them recommendations using the pooled method, just to have a comparison so they can see the difference between the two. And last year, when we did this, again, looking at hundreds of reserve studies, we found that the average difference in the recommendation was about 200%. All right, let me make that clear. On average, the clients that are still using the straight line, the component method for reserve funding, would require triple the amount of funding out of pocket from the owners if they stay in that method than if they were to pool the reserves together. Okay, now, obviously, given that pretty much every single association out there is always trying to cut costs, trying to lower the assessments, lower the impact to their owners, one of the easiest ways we're able to help them do that is to teach them about pooled reserves, right? They make that switch and they hopefully never look back. Okay, so the good news here is that we do have a better option. The pooled method, also known as the cash flow method, is, in our opinion, the better way to go. So for background, this method has only been approved in Florida since 2002, but I can tell you that because we're a national company, outside of Florida, the method has been around much longer than that, and it's used pretty much universally throughout the country. Okay, we have 12 offices throughout the US. Our Florida office is the only one that ever has clients using the straight line method. So in contrast from the other way around, the pooled method, you might argue, is more complex in theory, but once you get the hang of it, it's actually a lot simpler to use it for budgeting. Okay, before we talk about how it actually works, one of the most common questions that I used to get when I gave this presentation is, well, if we have the straight line method now, but we're interested in switching over, how do we do that? So I put together this little slide here to talk through that process. First and foremost, I want to make it real clear. A board can create a new pooled reserve account all by itself. So for example, the board can say that as of this upcoming fiscal year, all of our new incoming reserve money will be going into a pool of funds. That itself does not require any ownership vote. However, if the board wants to move money from the existing straight line accounts into that new pooled fund they've just created, that does require the owners to vote and approve that. It's basically the same idea as when you move funds from one reserve account to another. It's considered, the term they use for this is a non-scheduled use of those funds. So the same voting process is required as if you were moving money, say, from painting to elevator reserves. Now, the good news here is that that's a one-time process. You don't have to take that vote every year when you adopt your budget. And lastly here, I would highly, highly recommend that you involve your association CPA, maybe even your attorney, just to help make sure you're going through the process correctly. And of course, if you've got a professional reserve study provider, they can certainly give you guidance as well. Okay. So the best way that I've found to explain the mechanics of this method is to go back to that same bucket analogy we used when we were talking about straight line. Only now what we're going to do is take all of those separate buckets of money that we talked about in the last few slides, and we'll just think of ourselves dumping those into one big bathtub, right? Once we've done that, we've essentially removed the labels from any specific categories of reserve funds. Instead, now we just have all of our reserve money collectively available for any component on the list. In other words, there's no such thing anymore as a roof reserve dollar or a painting reserve dollar or an elevator dollar. It is all just reserve money that can be spent much more effectively, much more efficiently. So we'll talk through the process of how we develop this budget using the pooled method, but actually it's important to point out the very first step of the process is exactly the same when you're using straight line. The foundation of any good reserve plan is an accurate component list. It actually doesn't matter which method you're using if the underlying data is unreliable, right? So again, you're going to use the exact same list of stuff, all the identical assumptions for life expectancies and costs, regardless of which method you're using. It's only when you get to the financial analysis part of this process that you have to make a choice as to which one you're going to use. So once you've got that list of reserve components dialed in, all the estimates, all the assumptions are as accurate as you can be, you're now going to look forward and you'll design a timeline of future expenses. Okay, most reserve studies will include something like this 30-year forecast. What we're going to look at here is, the total amounts of reserve money that will be spent in any given year. Now notice there's no labels here. This is just the combined total of reserve spending that's taking place within this association. Once we know what those future expenditures look like, the next step we have to do is to determine how much money needs to go into that pooled account in order to meet those expenses, right? Fairly straightforward process, but we'll just talk through these steps. So the first thing we're going to do is determine the sum total, right? How big is our pool of funds at the start of our fiscal year. So right now we're looking at, January 1st, 2022 for most of our clients. How much money will they have in total on that date? The next thing we're going to do is plug in an amount for an estimated contribution to that reserve account. Now that can be a combination of cash, budgeted contributions, but also interest earnings. Okay, so notice here we have a nice advantage already over the straight line method where you can't really factor in future interest earnings to your income assumption. The next step is to go back to the forecast of expenses and see what estimated costs are coming up on the schedule for that year. From there, you simply do the math, right? You take your starting cash position, you add your reserve income, you subtract your reserve expenses, and you'll see where that leaves your account balance going into the following year. Now, when you look at the start of that year, you have to make sure that you'll have some money in the bank, right? If you don't, then obviously you need to go back a step, use a higher contribution rate for that year, because you're never allowed to design a plan that would have you going below zero in reserves. We'll talk about that more in just a moment. Now, the beauty of doing this process using an Excel spreadsheet or some other type of software is that you're able to model that pattern going forward. Okay, you can look at many types of projections going out for many years at a time. It only takes a few seconds using a spreadsheet or a software program to see how much money you'll be spending over the next 20, 30 years, however long you're going to look out, and therefore how much money you'll need to contribute those years, keeping your account balance at a safe level. Now that leads me to a very important point here. There are some differences of opinion over what is considered to be a quote unquote safe level. Basically, there's three possible funding objectives. These are known as baseline funding, full funding, and threshold funding. And I'll break each one of those down in that order. Okay, baseline funding, the first option on the table. I'm not gonna, mince words here. This is the riskiest way to fund your reserves. Now, it is perfectly legal to do, but for most communities, this is not a good idea, okay? The objective here is that you're figuring out what is the bare minimum amount of money that you'll need to put into reserves to keep your account balance above zero throughout the forecasted timeline. I'm going to make this as clear as I can. When I talk with managers and accountants, it seems that there's a big disconnect in the terminology here. Okay, the problem that I've come to observe here is that if you talk to most people in Florida and you ask them what they mean by fully funding a pooled reserve account, what they will then describe to you is what I'm referring to here as baseline funding. Okay, it's the minimum that's required by law unless you get a vote of the owners to approve something less than that. Okay, now this is basically what most boards and CAMs want to know at budget time is what's the amount of money that we need to put into the budget so that we don't have to get a vote of the owners to approve something less. And the law says that that amount, that number that needs to be put in the budget to avoid anybody voting on it, is the amount that would be required to keep a positive cash balance in the reserves over time. And anything above zero is acceptable. Okay, this is the actual language that comes from the Florida legislation with respect to pooled funding. Basically says that your contribution rate needs to be enough so that over time your cash inflows are greater than your cash outflows, but that's it. There's no other requirement or caveat to go along with that. If you take the time to read the legislation, the term fully funding is not actually used anywhere with respect to the pooled method. The closest thing you'll probably find is the term sufficient funds. In fact, the DBPR, the Department of Business and Professional Regulation, has a manual that they've published for a number of years, which is a guide that's used by managers and board members. Some of you out there may be familiar with this. It explains how to design a pooled funding calculation. So in the example that they have in that manual, the sample association they're using gets to a point where they have $4, not 400, not 4 million, $4 in their reserve account, and that is labeled as sufficient funds. Now, before we go on, another rhetorical question for you. Does anybody out there, whether you're a board member, a manager, or if this is the first time you've ever heard about reserves, would you ever think that it's a good idea for a community to have $4 in its reserve account? Okay, we certainly don't think so. I hope you would recognize that's a very dangerous approach to take. Obviously, that means that if you're doing the bare minimum, it only takes one thing to go wrong to completely blow up that plan, right? That can be a project that happens a little earlier than you anticipated or costing a little bit more than you thought. The point is that if you're trying to thread the needle that closely, you have no margin for error. Okay, the chances that you'll need a special assessment or a loan are very, very high. And if one of the main reasons that we're funding reserves in the first place is to try and prevent that from happening, well, then I would say, this is a totally unreasonable strategy. Right? If you look at this table here, this is a real world example of what baseline funding looks like. Starting up at the top left corner of the table, okay, the first column here on the left shows all 30 years of the financial plan from top to bottom. If you read from left to right, you're going to see different numbers corresponding to each fiscal year. You got your starting reserve balance, you have your fully funded reserve balance, which we use to calculate percent funded, right? We know that different levels of percent funded carry different types of risk, so we can make a call if that's a low, medium, or high risk position to be in. When you move to the right, here we've got the proposed reserve contribution rate for that fiscal year. We've got a column that shows the increase over the prior year measured as a percentage, okay? We've got another column here that shows if there's any need for any loans or special assessments. We've got our assumption for interest income. And then lastly, we've got the projected expenses for that year, okay? So now that we've got a nice easy spreadsheet, we're gonna be able to do some math pretty quickly, all right? Let's just look at the first year in this example. This community would, in this case, have about 1.1 million in reserves, which we would compare against this theoretical fully funded balance, with a little over 1.2. We determine that they are 89.9% funded. Okay, so now we know where they stand today. And the question now is to figure out how much of a contribution rate is required to at least meet the expenses, but also to keep their starting reserve balance above zero. Again, this is a baseline funding scenario. So what you see in this plan is that even though the association's starting from a strong position, they got a lot of stuff to do, right? They have a lot of projects coming up in the near future. And based on this proposed contribution rate, as they're putting cash in and then taking cash out, we start to see this account balance eventually start to decline, okay, relative to the fully funded balance. They get to a point eventually, about halfway through the timeline, where they only have $245 in the bank, right? Now, if you look closely, the amount that they should have at that time, that theoretical fully funded balance, is close to $400,000. So again, just to reiterate, although the state of Florida would call this sufficient and the owners wouldn't have to vote to approve this, this is a very risky position, right? They're going from a position of strength to a position of weakness very quickly. Perfectly legal, but probably not a good idea. Okay, we've talked about the minimum requirement, right? The riskiest option. Let's go to the other end of the spectrum, which is the more conservative option, full funding or fully funding your reserves. Now, I'm going to be real careful here. When I'm using the term full funding in the context of a pooled reserve account, I'm using the definition that comes from National Reserve Study Standards, okay? As I said before, most people in Florida have a concept of fully funding, which is what I just showed you, but now you know that's baseline funding. Bit of interesting history on this, okay? CAI, Community Associations Institute, adopted these National Reserve Study Standards back in 1998, a full 4 years before pooled funding even became allowed in Florida. So, you know, I wish I had been in the room when that was taking place. It would have been nice if they would have just adopted some of the terminology that already existed, but here we are. Now, the definition of full funding that I'm putting out for you now means that you're setting an objective to attain and maintain your reserves at or near 100% funded, which again is why it's so important to understand that concept of percent funded. So if you haven't fully grasped that, please go back and watch that recording. Give me a call. We've got a ton of information on our website that can help make that clear for you. How would that look, right? So using the same scenario as before, but in this time, if we're wanting to design a full funding plan, again, that means we're going to set a target of attaining and maintaining a position of 100% funded. So there's a couple things that are identical from the prior scenario. The reserve expenses right here on the far right, these are identical to what we saw before. The starting cash position is identical, right? The only difference now is that we're recommending a higher contribution rate that builds up a cushion of funds over time, right? They never get to that weak position where they might have to rely on a special assessment or a loan. Okay, so another way to look at this comparison on this chart, we're looking at on the left-hand side a vertical axis measuring percent funded from 0 to 100, right? At this black line there. Down on the bottom, we're looking at time. Here's the 30-year timeline. Okay, the different colored dots along the way are measuring percent funded based on our different scenarios. So again, notice they all have the same starting point. If you look at the green dots, this is the recommended full funding plan. Okay, you see that percent funded is starting at a strong place and never gets weak, right? It attains and maintains 100% funded. That's the definition of full funding. The orange dots here represent that baseline plan. So if you look closely, that actually seems okay for about the first 10 years or so, but then it starts to fall off a cliff, right? We allow it to get as close to zero, that's that $245 balance right here, but with never going below zero. So you see that although it never hits zero, and it does kind of bounce back up again, it never regains the strength that it once had, okay? Now let's talk about the difference in terms of cost. Okay, the baseline plan in this example required $70,500 in contributions, and the full funding plan called for $94,500. Measured as a percentage, the full funding plan is about 34% more expensive. Now that's actually a much higher difference than we normally see. Most of the time, the difference between baseline and full funding is actually closer to like 15 or 20%. But think of it this way, even at 34% more expensive, in this specific example, that only amounted to about $15 per unit per month. Okay, so think about that for a second. Less than $1 a day per owner meant the difference between doing the riskiest possible thing and the safest, most responsible thing. Okay, there's one other thing to talk about here. Keep in mind that we have a series of purple dots here. That's the current plan, right? If they just kept doing what they were doing, right, making no changes at all, that's where we see these purple dots. And it's very clear here, and we leave this to show the client, look, you've got to increase your reserves no matter what, because if you just stay on this track, you're going to fall off a cliff. You will go below zero here. So while you're at it though, if you're going to make these increases, let's do this in the most responsible way possible. Okay, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the last option here. It's pretty simple to understand. Basically, threshold funding means any objective between baseline and full. So essentially what happens here is you pick a target and then you design your funding plan accordingly. So for example, you might say, instead of becoming 100% funded, we will aim to become 70%. All right, another way to do it is to say, we want to make sure that we never drop below $1 million in our pooled reserve fund. Now, one of the problems with this approach is that it's a lot more subjective. Okay, if you have one board in one fiscal year saying that they think 50% is a good threshold, but the next year a different board's in place and they say, no, we're okay with 20%, that has a dramatic effect on the amount of money going into the bank, right? These are usually kind of unique scenarios. We do occasionally do these for clients based on their input, but as I talked about on the last slide, it usually just makes more sense to fully fund than to pick some arbitrary threshold target anyways. All right, we've got about 5 or 6 minutes left here. I'm going to get through one last important concept and then we'll have time for Q&A. What I'm going to talk about to you now is one of the most frustrating parts of being a reserve study provider in Florida at the present day. On the screen in front of you, I've got a paragraph that I copied from the Florida Administrative Code. Now I copied a section, this is from the condo section of the code, but the identical language is there for HOAs, okay? Basically, this is the state's official interpretation of what is written in the statute. And in the section where they talk about pooled reserve funding, they have this one sentence down here at the end where they talk about a funding plan not allowing for balloon payments, okay? Now, I'm sure when they wrote this, they had good intentions. I think that the inspiration behind this was to prevent boards of directors from intentionally kicking the can down the road, okay? The term they used, though, balloon payment, has a very different understanding in most contexts, okay? The general understanding of the term balloon payment typically describes a situation where, for example, you've got a mortgage, and for the majority of that mortgage, the borrower pays a certain amount of money each month, and then at the very end of the term, they make one final single payment, which is much larger than any of the payments that came before it. Now, if you think of that in association terms, it makes sense why that's not fair. Basically, they don't want an association to do the bare minimum, to do some tiny amount of reserve funding for many years, and then at some point in the future, just plug in a huge amount of reserve funding in some particular year when a big project is going to take place. So for example, let's say you've got a townhome community that needs to replace its tile roofs. That will almost always be the largest expense in their reserve schedule. So let's say that a board is looking at their budget and the tile roof project is scheduled for 10 years later. The board that's in place today might be tempted to say, hey, look, we can get away with doing a lower level of funding for the next 9 years if we assume that in year 10, we'll just plug in a huge number that covers the cost of the roofs. So what they're essentially doing in that scenario is committing that future group of owners, right, the people who will be there in 10 years, to pick up the tab. They would have to pay that balloon payment. That would allow the owners in the present day to get by with doing a much lower amount of funding. To me, that's not fair, and I understand why they would want to put a stop to that. So far, you're thinking, well, okay, Will, so what? Well, here's the problem. Over the last several years, it's been brought to our attention when we talk with associations and specifically with the accountants who are doing financial audits for associations, that the term balloon payment in this context has been interpreted to mean any increase whatsoever in the reserve funding amount. So for example, I might tell a client, this year you need to contribute 100,000 to reserves, and that's based on an analysis using the current replacement cost for all your components and looking at their remaining life expectancies. Next year, we can reasonably assume that costs will go up due to inflation. And to keep up with that assumption of inflation, you guys should probably plan to contribute, 103,000 in year 2. Then in year 3, costs continue to climb. You should plan to contribute a little bit more. And then again in the year after that. Normally, I would say that seems reasonable. But the problem we've run into is that the state has said, no way, no. Any increase from one year to the next is a balloon payment in our view. Now, our response to that has been, well, wait a minute, you're allowing us, maybe even encouraging us to use the assumption of inflation in our studies. That means that the costs of the components that you're saving for will be going up over time. We all agree on that. But what you're now telling us is that we're not allowed to assume any increase to the contribution rate. Okay, that's a major problem because now if we do all agree that inflation is real, that costs will go up over time, but I'm not allowed to make the same assumption on the other side of the model that the cash going into reserves can also increase over time. Now it gets a lot more expensive to make a plan work because, in other words, you're allowing the assumption that the expenses will go up, cash going out will always be higher, but cash going in cannot increase by the same token. Now, if you remember, we need to keep creating a plan that meets some specific criteria, not going below 0, for example. But in order to cover those rising expenses due to inflation, all else being equal, I would be forced to use a higher contribution rate in the near term of the funding plan in order to hit the same goals, the same objectives. That places an unfair burden on the current ownership. In that scenario, they're expected to pay more money than they really should for reserves. So, we've complained about this. The response has been, well, then just take out inflation, okay? Don't assume that costs will go up, and that should make things balance out. And that's the part that really gets under our skin. Okay, we're in the business of delivering financial recommendations, and now we're being told that one of the key principles when you're making a long-term forecast should just be removed and ignored. Nobody in their right mind assumes that something that costs $10,000 today will still cost $10,000 15 years later. I don't think there's any aspect of the economy where that's true. But in order to make these plans work, that is the only logical conclusion, right? We're asked to take out inflation, which then allows that level funding amount to be more appropriate. So what does that mean for you all? The message that we all need to reinforce to associations is that budgeting for reserves is an annual exercise, right? You can't just have a reserve study done one year and expect that you can use that same document for 3, 4, 5 years in a row, especially if there's no inflation that's factored in there. Every single association has to produce a new reserve schedule every year as part of the budget. That will always be based on the market pricing for the components at that time. That's the only way to realistically keep on top of things. Okay, so in the same way that you have an annual audit done, you need to have an annual reserve analysis done. That's the bottom line. Okay, it makes any forecasting beyond 1 year unreliable. All right, so before we wrap this up, we'll go to Q&A, just a couple parting thoughts. Hopefully we all agree now that reserves are incredibly important for associations, both now and in the future, okay? When you're designing those annual budgets, I want you to encourage your associations to think hard and choose wisely about which method they're using to do so. And then once you've done that, make a smart choice about what the long-term objective of the plan should be, right? The goal of reserve budgeting is never to keep the dues low. It's not to make the members happy, okay? It's to take care of the community. As leaders in the industry, if you're a reserve specialist, a property manager, or a board member that's out there serving your community, it's our collective responsibility to teach people this stuff, to educate them, and to help them make wise financial decisions. And with that, we will go to Q&A. Thank you all so much. I'll turn my camera back on, and I don't know if we've got any already selected here. I see about 4 questions showing up in Q&A, but Jeff, Terry, how do we want to proceed?
Yeah, we have some straightforward questions here that seem general enough. They're not ultra specific, which I know if you do have anything ultra specific, you're going to want to consult your association counsel, somebody like Will, a reserve specialist, or your documents. But in this case here, what is the most common method with COAs in your experience?
Sure, I'd take that question to be which is more common between straight line and pooled. You know, anecdotally, I can speak for our company to say that, you know, it's as of last year, it was about 1/3 that were using the straight line method, about 2/3 using pooled. Nationally, it's not even a question. I mean, almost all of the associations that we work with as a company, and this is thousands of associations all around the US, are using the pooled method. So it's by far more common, and typically, you know, that's because it allows for a lower contribution rate.
Okay, yeah, and you touched upon that earlier as well. And I wasn't aware that Florida is pretty much the only state that uses that one method.
That I'm aware of. I mean, you know, when I talk to my colleagues who run our other offices, you know, some of them have not done a straight line study in decades.
Wow. Okay, gentleman, person named George, for pooled, I can determine the funding number by trial and error based upon a required baseline of a zero balance, although it is not a trivial procedure. Do I have to follow the same trial and error to arrive at a threshold of, say, about 40%? And he's also thanking you. And by the way, you may want to touch upon this. Well, he says, great book by your firm. Maybe tell people about your book.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I'll get to the question first, and thank you, George. Yes. So it is basically a trial and error process, right? You're plugging in a proposed contribution rate, which will, you know, satisfy a certain amount of funding and meet a certain objective. And the only question is how much is left after you've paid your expenses, right? So it is a trial and error process. I mean, when we prepare a study, our goal is typically to hit 100% funded as smoothly and as gradually as we can. But if you wanted to set a threshold of 40%, all you need to do is look at the ending year balances, or I should say the starting year balances, and the corresponding level of percent funded in each year, and, you know, try different numbers until you settle at something close to 40%. Thanks for the compliment on the book. Yes, so earlier this year, we published a book. I'll see if I have a copy that I can grab real close here, but it's called Understanding Reserves. You can get that on Amazon. It was kind of spearheaded by my colleague, Kevin Leonard, but all of us, you know, kind of within the company contributed to that. It's a great foundational book out there. If you're a manager, board member, it's a fairly quick read, but we'll cover a lot of this stuff in great detail. So thank you for plugging that for us.
Awesome. Hey, take a look at the next one there from Ronald. We have only 2 capital assets, which are straight line. What sense does it make to switch, or does it make sense to switch to a pooled method with that low of an amount of items?
Yeah, sure. Well, if you've only got 2 components in your reserves, I'm just going to make a wild guess here and say that maybe that's roofing and painting, right? It may not make a huge difference in your scenario. That's kind of an unusual case where you only have a couple things you're reserving for, but it may be advantageous if the relative funding levels in those 2 accounts are very different, right? So if your painting reserves are very low compared to where they should be, and your roofing reserves are very high, but let's say your roof project is not occurring for several years in the future, it would be advantageous to pool the money together, allowing you to tap some of that roof project money for your painting work, which is coming up sooner, as opposed to having to raise the painting funds more quickly. So, you know, all of this is, you know, a case-by-case scenario. It's, there's very few universal laws in this business, but I would say the majority of the time it is still advantageous. Even in that scenario, if you wanted to move money from roofing to painting, you would still have to get a vote of the owners, which, as I talked about, can be an arduous process. So it may not be the right solution for 100% of communities out there, but by and large, we do think it's the way to go.
Fantastic. Nadine asks, 0% inflation. Please explain, please elaborate.
Sure. Hey, Nadine, how are you? Yeah, so basically that means that we are not assuming that any costs will increase from one year to the next. Okay, if I plug in a $30,000 cost for an asset this year and it has a 5-year useful life, that means it's recurring every 5 years. But we're not going to assume that the cost goes up. So it'll be 30,000 now, 30,000 5 years, 10 years, 15, 20 years down the road. Just to make it abundantly clear, that's silly. We don't at all think that that is reality. What we have to do to comply with this requirement is to show that the funding of reserves is level. Now, the only reason we take out inflation is to balance that out, right? We're not allowed to assume any increases in contributions and cash going in. So for at least this one fiscal year that we're doing a study for, we're going to take out inflation. Now, in reality, as we work with that community next year, the year after, 3 years later, we will absolutely be inflating those costs at that time. Every time we have a chance to do a new reserve schedule, or if that community is doing it for themselves, they should absolutely be using inflation from one year to the next, constantly reevaluating and making sure they're using current cost estimates for their projects. Yeah, inflation is absolutely real. I mean, when I look backwards, we have got data going back for like the last 100 years. And if we look at any 30-year window of time, right? If you pick, really almost any window of time within those 100 years, and you look at the average annual inflation rate over the period of time, it tends to be between 2.5% and 3%. So we've always used 3%. When I talk to vendors in the industry, when I talk to a roofing company or an elevator company, and we ask them, what's normal for you guys? How much do you raise your prices, or how much should we be telling our clients to plan for in terms of increases? The most common response we get is about 3%. I mean, that's a historical average. It's realistic. All you have to do to test that is ask yourself, what did your home cost 30 years ago? What was a gallon of gas 30 years ago? A gallon of milk? I mean, that is real. Certain years we may have zero inflation from one year to the next, or it might be 1% or 2%. Certain asset categories can go up by a higher amount. Things that are tied to the price of oil, for example, may be increasing at an even higher rate. But on the whole, on average, we've always found that 3% is a good, reasonable year-to-year assumption.
Well, my own question, did you find anything radically, crazily different the last year and a half because of the pandemic, with certain resources becoming less or becoming more scarce? And did that throw reserve contributions out of whack in the past 16 months or so?
Yeah, a little bit. So basically the whole global supply chain was disrupted, right? So everything from, manufacturing of air conditioners to paint products, the supply chains were all disrupted. So
some of them still are.
Some of them still are, absolutely. I think probably people saw the headlines earlier this year. Lumber prices went up by like 40%. Hopefully that's a temporary disruption and things will come back down to their kind of pre-COVID levels. Fortunately, in I think almost everywhere in the U.S., construction was considered an essential business, so there was not major layoffs in the construction world. It didn't really affect the labor market quite as much. But yeah, if you had to pay for certain things within the last year, it's unfortunate that it might have just been bad timing. Where we really see that, though, on a more frequent basis is after hurricanes, right? Every time there's a hurricane that hits South Florida or Florida in general, you're going to see a huge spike in tile roof pricing, really any sort of roof pricing, just as so many buildings are affected all at the same time. There's only so many qualified roofing companies and material suppliers out there that can respond to that. So it's not uncommon for 2-3 years after a storm, we're still seeing these rates that are higher than normal. So yeah, it happens, and all the more reason to take a good hard look at this stuff every year as part of your budget process.
Take a good hard look at it and form relationships with your service providers, because
Yeah.
that's not a bad thing either. Okay, Bonnie, I just want you to mention that once, or I just want to mention that once your board switches to a pooled category, you still need to vote every year on whether to fully or partially fund the reserves. I know some CAMs who think that once you have a pooled reserve category, you do not need to vote on fully funding or partially funding. That's true or false?
Absolutely true. And Bonnie, that's a great point. Thank you. What I meant by not having to vote annually is the vote to have a pooled reserve account as opposed to straight line. So once you have combined all your funds into a pool, you've taken all your buckets and dumped them into the pool, you don't have to vote to do that every year, but absolutely every year you have to vote as to how you're funding within that method. So whether it's straight line or pooled, in fact, the default that goes into effect is full funding. Okay. It's only if you get a vote to do less than that, that you would have to have the owners vote. And in the pooled context, that vote is required if you're going to go below baseline funding.
So we have two more questions and we're getting towards the end of the advertised time here. So we'll do these two questions. Any questions that come in from this point, please just put them on the evaluation and we'll make sure that Will gets them. So the last two questions, the first one from David: mortgage companies look for a 10% budgeted reserves funding to qualify borrowers for a loan. Does it make sense to try and meet that percentage point when creating your annual budget?
Yeah, let's talk about that. So I would say that is a good bare minimum number to try to hit. What David's asking about is typically for government-backed loans, right? If somebody's going to come in with a low down payment, first-time home buyer, you know, a VA mortgage, something like that, where the government is actually insuring it. They have a whole laundry list of criteria that they look at to approve the association itself. And one of the criteria is that the association has to be budgeting at least 10% of its annual budget to reserves in order for them to approve that loan. The reason for that is because they don't want somebody who's coming in and buying a home to buy into a community where there's a high risk of a special assessment. Because if the owner gets hit with that special assessment, it may compromise their ability to pay the mortgage. That's why the government and the mortgage lenders care about this stuff. So they have come to use 10% as a rule of thumb, but it's usually the case that associations need to be contributing much higher than that. To actually properly do this correctly, what we've found is that associations on average should be contributing between 15 and 40% of the total budget to reserves. So if you're in a high-rise condo out on the beach, especially if it's an older property, 10% of your budget is probably going to be way too low. You'd have to go through the exercise of doing this properly to find out what the right number is. If you wanted to set 10% as kind of your starting point, just to check that box and get those mortgages approved, that's good. But usually that's not a safe level. It actually still needs to be higher than that.
Okay. And the last question here from Jeffrey, not this Jeffrey. Does Florida law allow HOAs to offer their association residents different percentage options to fund their reserves by a vote, say 100, 75, or something different, or 0?
Yeah. So what all associations in Florida have to do, and to be more specific, what boards have to do, is to present a budget that shows what it would take to fully fund the reserves, which if you're using straight line is very clear. It's following the calculations: cost minus existing funds divided by remaining life gives you a number. Anything less than that needs to be voted on. So a board could say, okay, here is the amount we've calculated. This would be 100% funding. As an alternative to our ownership, we're going to go ahead and offer them, plan B. Here's at 75%, 50%, or to waive reserve funding entirely. Now, I would never say that's a good idea, but a lot of communities out there will say, our owners don't have an appetite for this. We know they're going to want to waive reserves. We've always done that. We've always underfunded. So let's go ahead and show them, okay, here's what we're obligated to show you guys, but here's some other options on the table. And and then the owners can vote to do what they want to do. So yes, the association board can present multiple options, but one of those options has to be the full funding of reserves. And in fact, if the vote doesn't take place, or if it doesn't pass for one of the lesser options, then by default, full funding goes into effect.
Thank you for that. With that, I want to mention one thing before turning it back over to Terry and for Will's parting words. First, I want to thank personally everybody for attending today. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your day. In the chat area, if you look there, there is the link. I put it there about 10:01 a.m. or your time, 11:00 a.m. I'm in a different time zone right now for the evaluation for this webinar. It'll also appear in as a link to click on when we end it. It'll pop up when this live portion goes away, and will also appear in an email that you will receive tomorrow morning around this time. And in that on that evaluation page is also a button to download the slides that Will used today. Terry, I'd like to kick it back over to you, please.
Okay, well, thanks everybody from me also. For those of you that don't know, this evening at 5:30, we're going to be doing a board certification. KBR will be presenting it. Jeff, you might want to just jump in for a sec and tell us how long that's going to be, because usually board certification is pretty long.
Yeah, this evening is for condominiums. HOA and co-op members are welcome to join, but this is for the certification for condominiums this evening. It takes a couple hours, but Allison usually wraps it up more quickly. The Q&A will take a little, well, may take it a little bit longer, but the bread and butter of it usually goes on for about 90 minutes. And it's 5:30 Eastern to 7:30 p.m. advertised. You spoke, we listened. We heard you wanted something beyond work hours, so we're trying to give you a little bit of everything here.
Right, and Thursday we're going to do it for HOAs, right?
Correct.
So
yeah, tskmarketing.com. If you go to tskmarketing.com, if you haven't already seen the emails that you received for Will's course today, or the board search, tskmarketing.com not only has all of our providers on there, and please check them out because they've vetted, they're wonderful, excellent reviews for all of our providers, but you'll also find our in-person events and our webinars via the website.
Right. And so the HOA one is tonight, and I'm sorry,
Condo tonight,
Thursday
condo
night.
tonight, HOA
The
Thursday.
condo tonight, where we have a lot of stuff going on, so it gets a little confusing. And Thursday is the HOA board certifications, and then on tomorrow, again at the airport, is our live events. So we're doing both. We're doing live events, and if you have questions, or if you're not on our mailing list and today was new to you, make sure you get on the mailing list, and then you'll get the live events and all the website information. So with that, it was a great morning. Thanks again, Will. We always appreciate you, and you help all of us get started with reserves. And we'll leave it at that. You'll do your evaluations. You'll get your credit. If there's any problems, get in touch with me. My phone number is 561-508-0500, and then we can help out with anything that you need. Okay.
Will, Will, before we say goodbye, one last time, how can everybody reach you?
Oh, thanks. Yeah. So the best way is just go through our website, reservestudy.com. If you're ever interested in requesting a proposal for your community, right there on the home page, I think it's up in the top right, there's a button that says request a proposal. You click that, and then it'll take you through a couple-minute process to submit all your information. Otherwise, my email is wsimons@reservestudy.com. And that's really all I've got. Thank you guys so much. I appreciate everybody tuning in this morning, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Stay safe.
Great.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.